Hello, my name is Claire Wong Wai. I am a current rising senior at St. Olaf College, majoring in sociology, anthropology, and Asian studies with an emphasis in psychology. My project will be our bookshelves right now, messages of bestseller versus racism-focused children's picture books. In 2020, we saw a surging increase in people who realized the reality of racial violence and systemic injustices. If we wish to progress towards a more just and equitable reality, we need to be having conversations about race and discrimination with young children. Children's literature is one way that we can introduce these topics and get these conversations started. Although there is an increase in children's books that focus on racial topics over the years, there are still misconceptions that children are too young or too innocent to be exposed to topics of race. However, it is crucial that we use these opportunities to help engage in important conversations so that they can be equipped with essential skills. Past research has suggested that picture books are beneficial mediums for engaging in racial conversations. They have found that young children can identify racial differences and develop attitudes, and even children as young as 2 are not only conscious of their own racial identities, but can participate in social discourses that could contribute to the continuation of prejudice, bias, and discrimination. Picture books can be a diverse form of literature that children can use to build their identities while simultaneously educating them about other identities that are different from theirs. This duality of being able to affirm identity and belonging while also encouraging racial socialization is often described as a metaphor that compares the multicultural picture books to windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors that let readers connect individually and to collective experiences. In addition to instilling empathy and empowerment, presenting stories of these underrepresented racial and cultural groups can have positive effects on children's literacy and their motivation to read, especially considering that they may be reading stories that they can relate to on a personal level. A handful of researchers have used different critical frameworks to analyze books for their messages, and they have contextualized that using critical race theory, which carries a fundamental understanding that racism is pervasive in society and it's maintained through policies and institutions, and specifically in this context, the education systems. Although critical literacy has been used as a way to encourage educators and students to engage in topics about societal power and privilege, they also use them to engage in texts that they can use to identify, resist, and counter injustices. Past issues researchers have encountered while analyzing picture book content include the quality versus quantity, especially in terms of diverse characters. Researchers have emphasized not only the importance of representation, but also the quality and the accuracy of how characters are portrayed. Along with this, people have looked at the main messages of books and whether they follow a colorblind approach, which intentionally ignores racial differences and avoids engaging in difficult conversations, versus the color conscious approach, which is a way to educate that openly acknowledges race and places policy, curriculum, and programming evaluations at the forefront of these perspectives. Lastly, we must consider who is telling these stories and who is illustrating these stories. Past research has found that a majority of stories that are about BIPOC characters are written and illustrated by white creators. So this calls into question the accuracy of the outsider versus an insider's perspective, and who has the right to tell these stories. Even past studies have stated that between 76 to 94% of children's picture books in the early 2000s were made by white authors and illustrators. This statistic just showcases the lack of racial diversity in picture book creators. In the case of Black stories specifically, researchers have stated that although it is not necessarily a requirement to tell a story of affirmation, racial identity could ensure that these stories are authentic. And other researchers have warned that cultural sensitivity and accuracy are limited if one comes from a different culture and identity than the characters they are creating in these stories. My project poses the three research questions. 1. How much substantive racial, ethnic, or cultural representation do children's picture books from the racism and the general category have? 2. Do the elements of racism books versus general category books follow certain plot tropes and narrative elements? And 3. How do the themes in racism books compare to the general category books regarding promoting messages of inclusive socialization, identity affirmation, and empowerment? Before starting coding, I predicted that more racial diversity and positive messages would be present in the racism focused picture books compared to the general category picture books. I also expected to see a difference in the prevalence of messages of inclusion, acceptance, diversity, empowerment, and struggle. Both book lists of the top 10 bestsellers in these two different categories were recorded from Amazon on the same day, June 3rd, 2021. These books were accessed through the Amazon bestseller list of 2021. The reasoning behind utilizing this website considers accessibility and relevancy, as Amazon is a highly popular and widely used website. Many parents and teachers use this site to order picture books, especially during such a racial awakening period, to find books for their children. In addition, online ordering is seen to be a convenient and safe method to obtaining books during a pandemic. The categories that each book is classified under is determined by the authors putting them on the website. The target audience for these books are between 1 to 8 years old, or also babies to third graders. The first book list collected is under the prejudice and racism category under the children's bestsellers, and the second book list includes the standard children's bestsellers just in general. The top 10 books were taken from each category, totaling in 20 books. This project compares within and between these two lists to explore any thematic and content differences to determine if children are being exposed to different content depending on the books they are reading. Here we can take a moment to glance at the top 10 bestseller books on the Children's Prejudice and Racism book list. And here's the list of the bestsellers in the general children's book category. Coding for these picture books includes basic elements such as looking at the book's cover, as well as the point of view of the narration, whether that's first, second, or third person, the story's setting, any implicitly implied or explicitly stated racial, ethnic, or cultural identities that are represented, the narrative tone, the story arc, or any adversities that characters go through. Content coding includes the intended goal of the book, which is based on the description of the book that is provided on the Amazon website, and also the cover and what it illustrates. The main theme will be the actual impact that the messages are giving off that the reader would get after reading the story. The character coding, it looks for the frequency that a protagonist appears, as well as their physical appearance, and then their personality traits. The antagonists will be looked at in the same ways for their appearance and their traits, as well as the secondary characters. And the author's identity and then the character match will be looked at, as well as the illustrator's identities and the character match. So, do their identities and experiences match up with the characters they're telling the stories about? And then the frameworks that will inform this project throughout each step include a critical race theory and critical literacy approach. The first book I will be highlighting in this project is the second best-selling book from the Prejudice and Racism book list. It is The Day You Begin, written by Jacqueline Woodson and illustrated by Rafael Lopez. This table showcases the four main characters in the book. We have Angelina, Rigoberto, and then two unnamed characters. They each face their own struggles that are individual to them. Angelina is the character that shows up most frequently. She feels different from her classmates because she has a different skin color and because of her curly hair. Additionally, she feels different because while her other classmates have gotten to travel around the world and go see new places, she's stayed at home and cared for her little sister. Rigoberto has also showed up a lot in the book, and he feels different because often others don't understand him, and he's recently moved from Venezuela, and he feels that there's a language barrier. There's an unnamed girl who's presumably Asian, and she shows up a few times as others were questioning the Korean cuisine that she had brought for lunch, asking, "What is that?" And then an unnamed boy who showed up a few times is feeling left out during recess, and as other kids are playing, he feels like an outsider just watching them and feeling that he just can't keep up with what they're doing. Looking at specific story elements that were coded for, this story takes on a very poetic and gentle tone as it's comforting and encouraging these characters and being very optimistic towards the future. The adversities that each character faces are very individualized. However, they have this unifying theme of, feeling like an outsider, often comparing themselves to their peers and not feeling understood. The story progression involves these issues and these struggles that they're facing, and it ultimately comes to a very optimistic resolution that's looking towards a future of acceptance for each other. To showcase just a few other aspects I coded for in stories, I compared the intended goal versus the actual impact. The intended goal is based off the cover, which is a big selling point for books and often grabs attention, and the description given that one would review before buying the book. Now, it seems that from the description of The Day You Begin, they talk a lot about feeling different. They're very affirming that, everyone feels like an outsider at some point. And they're also very optimistic in saying that if we share our stories, others could be happy to meet us halfway there. Concerning the actual impact, after reading this book several times, it seems that the main themes that are getting across to the reader include affirming identity and then the differences that we all have. It's validating that everyone will go through adversities and that's completely normal. And then it is hopefully looking towards the future, towards a collective acceptance of each other. The second book that I want to highlight is also one that comes from the Children's Best-Selling Prejudice and Racism books list, and it's number 9. It's Mixed, a colorful story by Ari Chung. This story only includes non-human characters. It's these colors. They are presented as large groups where we have the reds, the blues, and the yellows essentially. And what happens is at the beginning of the story, they're living harmoniously in a city together. But then one day, one of them starts arguing with another over who is better. And that ultimately brings this turmoil, and then they decide to segregate their city. Until one day, one of the color notices another, and they see that they have value in each other. And so they start mixing. As you see on the bottom right hand corner, the yellow and the blue mix to make this little green color. And they really emphasize in this book that this green helped get the colors back together as they thought it was really cute and they decided like, oh, we can get along. And so ultimately they come back together and they're able to live in society together again. Overall, this book had a very direct and formal tone. It was not as poetic as the previous book. The adversities that were looked at included the reds, the blues, and the yellows fighting over who was better, and that led them to segregating in their city. And then they even were saying things like colors shouldn't mix. And then the story progression ended up being more of a collective group effort. It didn't seem like individual struggles like the previous book. Rather, they were good and then they had some issues and then they were able to resolve those in the end. Looking at this book's description, its intended goal aimed to be a book that is inspiring and discusses color tolerance while embracing differences. The actual impact of it was telling the story of these groups that were living together peacefully, then segregated, and then were able to resolve their issues. And it also talked about accepting and encouraging the differences that these different colors came from different groups. However, it does seem to be a very general and abstract representation. So, although it is encouraging acceptances and differences, it's based on only one factor, which is color. And then the colors showcased in this book are not actual human skin tones. So it's important to consider the implications of this book, as if readers directly apply this book to the situations of segregation, and especially the mistreatment of Black people in the US, it could be oversimplifying, and if used as a teaching guide, we must consider how it could go awry. This presentation only showcases 2 out of the 20 total picture books, 10 from each list, that will be coded and analyzed. Some implications that we must be thinking about now include who tells these stories. So, are they people who identify with these characters that they're writing about and these experiences, or are they not? And if they are not, does that change anything and the impacts that these books have? Also, what messages are there present in these books? So are they showing, BIPOC people in a positive light? Are they going through and conquering their struggles and their fears and the issues that they're facing? Or are they depicted in a different light, whether that's negative, or are they just there to check boxes and they don't have much substance? Additionally, yeah, how are the characters represented? And then how are they interacting with each other, and how are they shown processing emotions and thinking to themselves? That's another thing to consider. Some limitations of the study include the lack of a coding team, whereas past studies have had 2 or more researchers who have gone through the same set of books to code for. I was the only researcher doing this, so if there was more time and more resources, it would have been ideal to have more people checking over the books multiple times to make sure we have a higher rater reliability and we're getting the same results and like interpretations from the books each time. Additionally, I only looked at the top 10 books in each list. If we were to make this a larger scale project, we would rather have more books, like thousands, looking at databases and the most books on those lists rather than just 20 total. But due to the scale and the time of this presentation, this wasn't as possible. I'm looking for further research in the future. We would want to look at the policies and the programs and how this is put into practice. So, only one part of this study is looking at just how these books are chosen and the content involved. It's not necessarily looking at, what are children getting from these books, which could be completely different from the intended messages. They could be only picking up on certain things, or how are the adults are reading these picture books talking about these conversations and these characters to the children, because that will definitely affect what they're absorbing and what their outlook is. Additionally, with more resources, we could go beyond this just content analysis and really examine this child interaction and how receptive they are and how much they're retaining from these books. So it's important to think of this in terms of, how do we want to reform and look at criticize education, make programs that could be helpful for especially literacy development, and then put these into practice, whether that's at school or at home. There are a few takeaways from this presentation. The first is that when choosing books for initiating conversations of race, we should really be emphasizing the content's quality. So this is not just using a checklist to say, oh, do we have enough racial and cultural and ethnic representation in these books, but also, do these characters have substance? Are they demonstrating positive attributes that could be good for role models of the young readers? Additionally, are they accurate representations, or could they possibly be perpetuating these stereotypes and biases that could actually further harm these communities? We should also be paying special attention to who creates these book lists and gives these recommendations. Now, looking back at this analysis, we can see that not all books, even if they're in this racism based category, will have equal content quality, will have the same messages. And so it's important to not solely rely on Amazon's recommendations or like a bookstore's category. Rather, if we truly want to be intentional. We should be seeking out recommendations from people who specialize in these areas and know how to start these conversations about race and have anti-racism education in their background. And lastly, parents, caretakers, educators, really anyone who's working closely with kids should explicitly identify what messages they intend to expose young children to before picking out and purchasing these books. This way, they're being very intentional and with what goals they have for children. And that way, children will have a better opportunity to learn and hopefully be more productive as they can be exposed to positive messages. Thank you for watching this presentation. I look forward to answering any of your questions and having a wonderful discussion at Tuesday's seminar.